Who gazers, and welcome back to Doctor Who Literature, the podcast taking you through the world of the target novelizations in publication order. My name is Jason, and I'm your host on this journey, this very long journey. As I record this, it is the second day of April, 2022, and a very exciting day for Doctor Who fans because this is the day that we received the 60-second trailer for Legend of the Sea Devils, which airs, as I record this, 2 weeks from tomorrow on Easter Sunday, 2022, April 17th. If you are a late discoverer of this podcast, that episode is possibly long since in the rearview mirror, but as I record this, we're a little more than 2 weeks away from seeing it. Very exciting trailer, some interesting special effects, what I hope is an appearance of the Merca, the Sea Devils for sure, Madam Ching for sure, and some pretty incredible costumes for the fam. The 13th Doctor and Yaz and Dan all out of their usual garb and dressed in appropriate pirate attire. So it's fair to say that we are very excited for this. I'm so sorry. In other Doctor Who news, we are up in my pilgrimage to Series 5 and Stephen Moffat's first year as showrunner in 2010. I watched yesterday The Time of Angels, and after I finish recording this bit, I'll be watching Flesh and Stone, the second part of the Angels two-parter. A few days ago, I watched Series 5, Episode 2, The Beast Below by Stephen Moffat. This was an episode that I enjoyed, I should say, when it first came out in 2010, but certainly is not anywhere near my list of favorites or even my top 50% of the show material. I enjoyed Beast Below a lot more this time around, perhaps because, as far as Moffat goes, it's very simple storytelling without a whole lot of timey-wimey or temporal impossibilities or muddled plot. It just tells its story, does its job, and gets out and never revisits the world again. But what I found interesting is that I noted from my Twitter thread on the episode, there were some similarities to previous Doctor Who stories. Most notably, I thought Paradise Towers, the business with the elevator going down to the basement, and Vengeance on Varos, the business with the voting. My friend Lewis Baston on Twitter pointed out that there were also elements of Invasion of the Dinosaurs, because you have, in essence, the reminder room, and you have mankind being brought to this room where they're shown the terrible thing they've done in order to launch Starship UK, and they're given the choice of whether or not they want to forget that this is what's happening. And Lewis pointed out that, yes, this is very much like the reminder room in Invasion of the Dinosaurs, and I was very impressed with the analogy. It hadn't occurred to me, and it's funny that he mentioned this because a few days earlier, Lewis and I had recorded the following interview for Doctor Who and the Dinosaur Invasion, which is the subject of today's episode. So I met Lewis on Twitter during my pilgrimage last year, and we've become friends. I'm happy to have him on the show. So we're going to discuss Doctor Who and the Dinosaur Invasion. Let's get to it.
Who's got the power to read? Who looks into books for the answers we need?
All right, Lewis, I understand that you have a book coming out.
I do indeed, Jason. Thanks a lot. It's a Black Archive volume, number 59 or 60, depending on quite what order things come out in, about the Sun Makers, Sun Space Makers in the TV series, and Sun Makers as a book. We may come around possibly later to do that. So it's coming out this summer. It's one of the most satirical political stories that Doctor Who has done. And in my day job, I do deal with history and politics. And so stories of that nature are always interesting to me.
How long ago did you pitch and write the text of the Black Archive? Because I know they have a hefty backlog.
They do. I pitched in 2020. Mine was advanced because it's quicker. It's been quite a quick process, I think, certainly by academic publishing standards. Because I more or less wrote it during the lockdown in 2020. I think it's quite ironic, given the themes of the series, The Sunmakers, that I was on a taxpayer-funded sort of vacation almost doing it. That I was the tax man was paying me to sit around and write this book. So I've dedicated it to the good people who work in the tax system of the UK. It's what Bob Holmes would have wanted, I'm sure. Although they did stick me with a stinging bill right at the end of the process when I did my 2021 tax return. So there's that as well.
You almost have to go back and put an epilogue to the book saying Robert Holmes was right all along.
Yes, these people are terrible. Don't let them control your planet. Yeah.
I don't want to spoil the topics of conversation that you're going to have in the book because we're still, I guess, a few months away from the street release date. Because I'm going in publication order, Invasion of the Dinosaur as the novelization is tied for 19 on the Target release slate. It came out the same month as 10th Planet. And I did 10th Planet last week, and I'm doing Dinosaur Invasion this week.
Mm-hmm.
I have most of my guests booked up through book 45, which is literally 6 months out, and Sunmakers is not yet there. So Sunmakers will be a long time before I come back to it on this program, but hopefully I will have you back to talk about the novelization. But I want to know now, are you discussing the novelization at all in your Black Archive? Because the novelization for me is interesting in that it sort of kind of changes the fate of one of the main secondary characters.
Yeah. I think the novelization is really interesting. I do discuss it. The novelization was a fairly long delay. Other than the Douglas Adams stories, I think it was the last Tom Baker to be novelized, November 1982. And Terrance Dicks does a bit of a rewrite of some stuff. He rewrites the morality of the story, that one of the villains gets chucked off the roof, and in the televised version, everyone's really happy about this. And in the novelized version, people are a bit ashamed of themselves for doing it. And there's also quite a nice bit where one of my favorite characters in the series, Marn, who's the sort of PA to the bad guy, it's left ambiguous on the televised version what happens to her. She kind of goes over to the revolution. And Terrance Dicks takes the opportunity of the novelization to reassure us that she's all right. She'll be okay. And also, right at the end, that's when Leela and the Doctor are saying goodbye. Terrance Dicks changes who's up there on the roof with them as they say goodbye. One of the most sort of violent and unpleasant characters of the Rebels is sort of written out of that sequence. Robert Holmes gives us a brutal revolution on the televised version, but things are made to be a bit nicer by Terrance Dicks in the novelization. And I think it's a kind of a really revealing moment about how the two authors regard the sort of central morality and purpose of Doctor Who. I mean, as what passes for an adult, I love the cynicism and brutality of the Robert Holmes one. But actually, Terrance Dicks was right. What should you put out at Saturday tea time? If you can imagine people living in tower blocks on Pluto, then let's imagine a humanistic end to a revolution. I think it's sort of possibly it's tempting to say that sort of Terrance Dicks kind of walked it back, really, but perhaps he was right.
See, I have the novelization of Pyramids of Mars coming up in about 2 months on this program. In Pyramids, which is a much earlier novelization, Terrance takes what is fundamentally a Robert Holmes script, and he makes it even more cynical. There's only one named character who is implied to survive in Pyramids of Mars, and that is the Egyptian porter who's in one scene at the very beginning of part 1.
He runs away.
And nothing is ever said as to his fate after he runs away. You can assume a happy ending.
Yeah.
Terrance goes back in the novelization and kills him off.
Oh, yes, I remember that. They had sort of guards with swords killing everyone running away from the site. God, yes, that was traumatic, yeah.
which is dark, man. But
Yeah.
to come back to Marn, when I am 11 years old, I was fascinated with the notion of who lived and who died in any given Doctor Who story.
Mm.
And I was watching these things on my PBS. They were aired one episode a night, Monday through Friday. So the night that episode 4 of Horns of Nymon aired, I was literally on tenterhooks, hoping against hope that Soldeed was going to
Oh,
find redemption and survive. And of
yeah.
course, he didn't. I was always fascinated by the morality of the Part 4 body count. And Marn, they don't give you an answer at all. She turns her gun around, she offers to join the rebels, and then I think there's a close-up on the grim, gritty faces of the rebels,
Mm.
and that's it. So I joyfully accepted the novelization of my headcanon, where not only does she change sides, but she loves it, and she finds herself much happier on the other
Yeah.
side.
I love Marn, actually. I mean, it's partly that I love Yonina Scott's performance in this as this sort of chilly PA, and there's depths to it. I mean, the way she plays her relationship with Haid, who is her creepy boss. There's a bit of a sort of suggestion that she's uncomfortable with Haid's physical touch.
I was thinking of that exact same thing when he pokes her in the belly and she turns to the camera and scowls. That's a beautiful actor's choice.
And it's sort of part, I think, of the kind of revolutionary theme that Marn. You can see it in two ways, I guess. You can say that Marn's one of the workers. Or you can also see that this is what the intelligent people like her and the guard captain who are associated with the old regime do, that they realize the game's up and they survive, and perhaps they end up running the revolution in due course. But I thought I was very happy to read her sort of inner monologue and at that point and see her emerge as a kind of hero of the revolution, borne aloft by the cheering workers. I thought that's great.
It's a great line, too. So, looking ahead at my list of upcoming stories, you're almost right. Sunmakers is the second to last Fourth Doctor novelization. The last one comes out a couple of books later, and it is, of course, Meglos.
Oh, and God, yes. What can you say?
That's a book where
Yeah.
Terrence just savages the scripts from Meglos in the book. He just throws shade at how illogical the TV story is. Whereas Sunmakers, he enjoys. It's his friend Robert Holmes, so he's doing his best to salvage it. Meglos is going to be quite a different kettle of fish entirely, but it'll be a long time before we get there on this program. So just keep that in mind as we go through the journey. We're still only in early February 1976. But lest my listeners think that we are here to talk about the Sunmakers today out of sequence, we are not. I am just plugging Lewis's upcoming Black Archive, which I cannot wait to be delivered.
Thank you.
We're actually here today, Lewis, to talk about a different and an earlier book. So what book do you have for me today?
Right, today I have let me get the title right for a start. Doctor Who and the Dinosaur Invasion by Malcolm Hulke, 1976, of which I had in my hot little hand when I was a young lad, the 1978 second impression, with a blood-toothed dinosaur on the cover, unfortunately, rather than Chris Achilleos' clack.
There are two versions of Dinosaur Invasion available in the States. You and I have the exact same copy. I do have the Chris Achilleos cover on a t-shirt, which I ordered from his online store a few years ago, although thanks to COVID, I no longer quite fit into the shirt as well as I would like, so I have it retired in my drawer, and I'm not wearing it for this recording. I'm wearing a Brooklyn-themed t-shirt instead. But the other cover in the United States is the Pinnacle. Pinnacle was and I think still is, a New York-based publisher, now under a different name. They had the license to do 10 novelizations, going from Day of the Daleks up through the Talons of Weng-Chiang. They have a cover for Dinosaur Invasion, which is similar to the 1982 Target reprint. I don't own that one. I own most of the Pinnacles. Dinosaur Invasion is one of the rare Pinnacle books that I own in Target form, because mostly the Pinnacle books replaced the Target original, at least for those 10 books, in U.S. bookstores. Mm-hmm. And I'm vamping for a moment while I can find the cover online. There we go. It is similar to the 1982 Target version in that you have a T-Rex with very recognizable London landmarks in the skyline. But it takes a lot more poetic license, I think, than the 1982 version does, and it almost goes back to the spirit of the Achilleos original.
Oh yeah, yeah. You've got all sorts of things going on there. You've got you've got the moon and some sort of you've got blimey, yeah, a spaceship, which spoilers does not feature in the actual story. Yeah,
Yes. It also is much more grim and dark because you have at the bottom of the cover you have all these skulls and bones scattered across what I guess is the bank of the Thames, and then you have a lot more dinosaurs in the background.
oh, yeah.
But the Pinnacle books had this fetish for spaceships because their first cover, Day of the Daleks, features the infamous Unit spaceship, which does not feature in the televised story at all. And here we get another spaceship romantically backlit against the moon. Perhaps the illustrator didn't read far enough into the book and thought that the colonist spaceship was actually real. Now, I got my book in the mid-'80s because I didn't become a fan until late '84 when I was 11 years old. You're coming to us from the UK, so why don't you tell us how you first encountered Invasion of the Dinosaurs on television? Because I would have got it, and as part of my syndication package, minus episode 1, starting in late 1985, and I, of course, got the book at around the same time. I no longer remember which came first. For your purposes, unless you were there in 1974 to see Dinosaur Invasion on its first airing, it's quite possible that you would have had the novelization first. So tell me about your origin story with this.
My origin story with there is a very long gap in my encounter with dinosaurs.
Right.
I was too young to see it when it went out. I became interested in Doctor Who and then a fan a couple of years afterwards. So the novelization was the first thing I saw. I loved Doctor Who. I also loved reading. So I was one of this generation of people who were really turned on to reading and to stories by Terrance Dicks and his colleagues who wrote the Targets. The Dinosaur Invasion was one of my favorites at the time. Possibly my very, very favorite was another Malcolm Hulke one, The Space War, i.e. the novelization of Frontier in Space, which I actually, somewhere in my parents' house, there's an exercise book in which the first book review I ever did was of The Space War. Then, of course, Invasion of the Dinosaurs, the televised version, was a bit of a sort of rare one. And I sort of fell out of love with the program sort of later in the 80s. And I didn't actually see it until, it might even have been until the DVD came out. So there's a very long gap there. And when I got hold of it, it was interesting. I think the gap was probably useful because I would have, had I been able to watch Invasion of the Dinosaurs when I was 16 or 17, I would have been mortified and embarrassed by it. There's a story I love from the book. I didn't realize it was regarded as a problematic production then. If I'd seen the dinosaurs when I was at 16, 17, I would have, probably disowned the entire series. Whereas coming back at a later stage, you can sort of, you can see past some of the effects that don't work. Very brave thing to try. And of course, the glory of the book is that the special effects are fantastic. The dinosaurs are really convincing.
Much more so than on. I'm remembering now that I would have seen the TV episodes first before reading the novelization because when they were airing this on PBS stations in the mid 80s, they released the story, but of course they weren't given the access to the black and white only episode 1, so they only showed episodes 2 through 6 in movie format. So it opens with Doctor and Sarah already sitting in the detention center van. And at that point, I didn't realize that 2 chapters worth of material were missing. And when my local PBS station ended up acquiring the same episodes, they screened it in episodic format, but they retitled the episodes. Instead of episodes 2 through 6, it became episodes 1 through 5. So it was
Okay.
actually a long time before I realized we were missing one of the 6 parts. And
One
of,
of
of
our
course,
episodes.
that way I wasn't missing Shugi. If I had
Uh,
read the book first, I would have expected Shugi to be the very first character we see on screen in episode 1. Alas, that was
uh,
purely a figment of Malcolm Hulke's prodigious imagination.
yes, yes. No, it is. It is. It. I think the whole problem with episode 1 not being available in color or being available in sort of shonky recolor. Um, it does. I mean, it has a weird effect on one's experience of the story as a whole. It does set it back in the. It does feel a bit like 70s news footage. Um, it does have this verite kind of thing about it, which is interesting. Given I think it accentuates an effect that was there already. That we travelled to a different sort of world to the one the Doctor normally goes to. Um, yeah, and I too sort of when I first saw it, I kind of thought, hey, where's the Scottish lad? Trapped in London, wants to see the football, and got
Right.
drunk instead. Yeah, no, it's a great opening. I mean, I think you mentioned this in the Sea Devils as well. It's something Malcolm Holt does, that you have these quite sympathetic characters early on who are there to demonstrate that the threat is real. Um, that Shui is killed by a dinosaur. That the guys in the Sea Devils are killed by sea devils, etc. And I suppose it just is a way. I mean, you can ramp up threat levels through things like sort of incidental music and lighting and so on. Whereas in a book, I guess the techniques you use are this sort of technique of having a sacrificial, sympathetic early character in a forward.
And Shugi, for my money, is much more vivid than the seaman who was killed off at the beginning of Sea Devils. Now, for my newer listeners, Sea Devils I discussed back in episode 9, which was just about 3 months ago at this point. It's hard for me to pick which of Malcolm Hulke's novelizations is my favorite because he does such remarkable things with every one of them.
Yeah.
Dinosaur Invasion, I don't know if I love it as much as Sea Devils purely from a writing standpoint. I
Mm-hmm.
think I take a few more life truths out of the Sea Devils book. But what I love is how radically he takes the 6 part episode structure on TV and blows it up in the
Yeah.
book. And he substantially removes a lot of material and he adds instead character insights and POV scenes that you wouldn't have been able to do. There's a couple of character POV sites that are literally impossible to achieve when your character is a stop motion animation puppet, for example.
Yeah. No, it is. It's a very radical book. I think the structure is different. The pacing is different in that the middle parts of the television program really are treated very economically, shall we say, in the novelization. Whereas some of the stuff like the stuff that's in part 1 gets a bit of time to breathe, and I think the book's great for that. And there are these wonderful moments where you do um, sort of you get to know what a dinosaur's afraid of. It's brilliant. And also, I think he takes the opportunity to restructure the kind of cliffhangers of it. I mean, this isn't my original observation. Somebody else got there first. I think it was John Arnold's Black Archive on the story. points out that the cliffhangers are entirely different. I think there's only one which coincides with the end of a chapter in the book. Basically, because a lot of the cliffhangers that you see on telly are dinosaur shots. Dinosaur goes raw and demolishes a house, dinosaur fights, whatever. And there's no way, even if you're Malcolm Hulke or Terrence Dicks, to make that an exciting cliffhanger more than once. So I think the book benefits from this, that you actually have sort of things at the end of chapters you can sort of put down and think and sort of think about. You wonder, where's this going to go next, rather than sort of a rather cheap thrill of a rubbery dinosaur appearing.
Just to give you an example, in our mutual edition, the episode 1 cliffhanger falls at the bottom of page 32, and it's the end of a paragraph, but it is not the end of a section, and it's certainly not the end of a chapter. Through the windscreen, the Doctor can see the gigantic shape of a Tyrannosaurus Rex blocking the road. The cliffhanger resolution is the next sentence. "What is it?" Sarah shouted. The chapter itself, which is chapter 2, actually ends several pages later at the bottom of page 37. "Good gracious," cried the Doctor. "We're not only dealing with reptiles that died out millions of years ago. This man has just stepped right out of the Middle Ages." And of course, that character has zero plot significance at all. But Hulk chooses him to be the end of the chapter rather than the dinosaur who actually is literally on the front cover of the book.
Yes.
Just to give an example.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's very radical. I mean, in defense of the guy from 11 something or other, I suppose he proves that it is actually time mucking about that's doing this, rather than somebody having kind of done a Jurassic Park sort of thing. But yeah, it's an unusual way to end a chapter. I mean, I suppose this is I suppose what you have is kind of an intellectual revelation. The Doctor kind of grasps something, rather than just a kind of I guess what was intended to be a sheer adrenaline rush of seeing this ferocious monster on the streets of London.
That's a very good point, because time is a feature of this book, and it's a feature of the many character POV signs that we get, because you have Professor Whittaker, who starts daydreaming about who else he can bring out of the past, such as, I think, Oscar Wilde. And then this is also the book where you have, it's really the only proper explanation that we ever get, but it's come out after the Pertwee era is over on television, so this is a good time to pull back the curtain. Malcolm Hulke actually explains what the Blinovitch limitation effect is and who was Blinovitch, and I was captivated by that explanation reading this at 11 or 12 years old, because it's a great idea. But Blinovitch was described as a great bear of a man from Russia who, because he, I believe, meets himself traveling in time, he throws his timeline into reverse and starts aging backwards through time. And the last I heard, he was approaching babyhood. That's my recollection of the scene. And of course, that was the favorite catch-all explanation for Barry and Terrence. Anytime there was some time travel going on in the Pertwee era, the Blinovitch limitation effect is described as a way to prevent certain types of time travel. But here, Malcolm gives us the explanation, and it's wonderfully cynical and dark.
Yeah, I mean, and it's a very useful piece of what Tom Baker called bafflegab. It just different kind of corollaries and so on can be added on to suit plot needs as and when they arise. Is it right at the end?
I remember it being towards the early middle part of the book when the Doctor is doing one of his experiments.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Here we go. It's on page 69.
Okay.
"Fascinating," said the Doctor. "The main difficulty is the Blinovitch limitation effect. Do you know about Blinovitch? A great bear of a man from Russia. At least he was until he dabbled. He put time into reverse for himself. The last I heard of him, he was reaching babyhood. Rather a waste, I think. He was a brilliant man, when he was a man." And that's it. When he's explaining, he's trying to find the source of the experiments, and he's doing his equipment, and that's his explanation on page 69 to Sarah in the middle of chapter 5.
and none of that's broadcast. And he also sort of talks about other time people, like a Chinese scientist called Chun Sen, but he hasn't
Who
been
hasn't
born
been
yet.
born yet? Yes.
So, but yes, I didn't actually realise that this is as near as we get to a definition. I'd always assumed that it was the thing about not being able to affect your later timeline, the sort of solution to the grandfather paradox. That there's some sort of thing that limits that, but I don't know. I think it is whatever the plot demands at any given moment.
And then, if not to be mistaken with the actual character grandfather paradox, who was a major figure in the 1990s BBC Eighth Doctor books.
Okay, we're getting into deep waters here.
Yes. So let's go back to the familiar, comfortable waters of Dinosaur Invasion.
Yeah.
We've talked so far about the cliffhangers. We've talked about Shugi. We've talked about Blinovich. This is almost unique among Malcolm Hulke's stories in that the bad guys are left-wing rather than right-wing neo-fascists. Now, General Finch, of course, is your standard right-wing military bully, but Malcolm comes back in the book and gives him a more sympathetic moment than you would ever see on television, because John Bennett was not playing the character that way at all. And Grover, of course, is coming from the left. He's an environmentalist, and he and Whitaker are coming at this from entirely the wrong angle. So it's almost Hulk turning the spotlight on his own side and showing, there are bad guys across the spectrum.
I mean, it's a kind of companion piece for me with Sunmakers in some ways, because you have Holmes being Holmes, who is sort of possibly kind of, insofar as you can pin down a political ideology, a bit conservative, actually writing what was a very radical story about revolution. And you have Malcolm Hulke, a socialist, and Barry Letts, an ecologist, doing this story which absolutely skewers the sort of a tendency within left and green movements. I think it's and you can only do it that well if you know what you're writing about. And I'm sure there were people Malcolm Hulke met through political things who surface here kind of probably loosely disguised as the Golden Age colonists. I find his portrayal of Grover is really interesting. Grover, although his plan is monstrous, he's actually quite a gentle guy in some ways. The best solution for Grover, as soon as he's rumbled by Sarah, is to kill her. Grover, and you could, in a situation where there's dinosaurs roaming around London, you can explain people disappearing, and he does. But instead, he likes her, and we're reminded in the book that there's this thing. I think Hulk tries to answer the question of why Grover doesn't just kill Sarah. He says that he admires her spirit, and I think Grover's feelings about Sarah were that he wanted people like her, really. That he felt she was her resourceful, spirited kind of nature would be an asset, and that he really, right to the end, kind of wants to convert her. He doesn't know he's a bad guy. Finch and Whitaker, I think, kind of do know they're bad guys. Butler, the Martin Jarvis character, is a sort of bit gleefully evil a couple of times on the television set, but then Hulk gives him this sympathetic backstory and sort of little redemptive moments in the book. There was this lovely bit in the book describing, kind of, again, entering into the character, Grover kind of at the unit HQ in a school, talking about what was it? Where are we? I'm sorry, I've lost my page. He looked around the headmaster's office. He remembered when he was a master in a grammar school long before he went into politics. They were happy days when the future seemed full of hope. he wished he could have that time over again. And that's not just signaling his kind of doomed nostalgia that gets him involved in a program to literally roll back time, but it also gives you a sense of this guy who's got some sort of normal feelings, who's got some idealism, who, yeah. You don't get that with Whittaker so much, although you do get the Doctor obviously respects Whittaker, and the Doctor talks when he first is introduced to Whittaker, the fact of the existence of Whittaker, and Whittaker's called a crank, and his research grant is refused. The Doctor says, "Well, sort of, people always say that whenever anyone has a good idea, they always get called a crank." And you get this sense of the Doctor actually being kind of have fellow feeling with Whittaker as an outsider. Only in the television series, Whittaker is obviously Peter Miles, and therefore really kind of obnoxious and creepy. Peter Miles, I'm sure, was a great bloke, but he was very good at doing obnoxious, creepy characters. In the book, Whittaker's rendered as a very camp gay man. And whether it's just a little bit of homophobia, because of course even progressive people like Malcolm Holt could be a bit homophobic, or whether it's sort of flagging up that he's somebody who has been ostracized by the scientific community for his sexuality and has turned bitter. Maybe a little sort of nod to the way that Alan Turing was treated. I don't know.
That's an interesting point. Let's talk about that for a moment. Because obviously when I'm 11 or 12 years old, that didn't enter into my consciousness at all. What are the parts of the book that show that Whittaker is coded as a gay man?
There's a sort of reference to him having manicured fingers.
Yeah. Yes, that's right.
He's so neat and precise, and that there is this sort of thing of the very sort of aesthetic, camp, prissy gay man about him. His two choices of people to meet if you travel to the past are Oscar Wilde and Noel Coward.
Yes.
And he's referred to as, I think, giggling at one point, where he may, I don't know, somebody's probably got all this on a database, but he may be one of the few men in a Doctor Who setting who are described as giggling. So I think there's this sort of thing of him being a sort of 70s version of what a stereotypical gay man would have been, or a gay man of a certain sort of this sort of aesthetic Noel Coward kind of level.
The part about Whittaker that grabbed me when I first read this is Butler is first described from Whittaker's POV as quote-unquote a man he disliked. And then we find out that the reason he dislikes Butler is because of the scar. And then later on, he has second thoughts and thinks it's a shame, it's a pity about that scar, because if not for the scar, he might have liked Butler.
Yes. And that, yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, that liking is clearly a physical, sexual kind of thing. Yeah. Yeah, no, you're right. I suppose, yeah. Yeah.
And on television, as you say, Martin Jarvis is kind of a generic bad guy. Butler does not really have much of a character apart from to stand around menacingly and look tough. In the book, Sarah insults him for the scar, assuming that the scar is the physical manifestation of his inner villainy. And Butler in the book gets off this remarkable monologue about being a firefighter trying to save a child when the glass hit him in the face and caused the scar. And Sarah immediately feels remorse and tries to apologize, but it's too late because Butler has locked her in the cellar and run away, and she never gets to reconcile with him.
Yes.
That is some deep level writing, especially in a book that's going to be consumed primarily by, children between the age of 7 and 13 at the time.
Yes. It's I love that. I mean, reading the book again, I just thought, wow, that's something which, struck deep. And it's there. It's an entirely kind of gratuitous thing. It's just giving us a bit of fellow feeling for this guy, a bit of, and it also, of course, reverses the sort of traditional it sort of plays with, I suppose you could say, the traditional association that you see in things like Bob Holmes does it a lot in Talons of Wayne Chiang and Caves of Androzani, disfigurement and so on being associated with moral wickedness. And you've got possibly this sort of thing that Butler obviously was a caring and brave guy who maybe sort of maybe his scar is what has alienated him from society. Maybe he's been treated like a criminal by people all the time before Sarah comes along.
And he's joining the bad guys to escape that kind of judgment and go back to a simpler age where he'll be treated more fairly.
Yeah, and maybe we can sort of we are allowed, I think, to read Whitaker's sour, sort of curdled disposition to his experience of homophobia. I mean, we can do that, or that may be reaching, but hell, we're talking about a children's story from 1978, so we can reach, I think.
Oh, of course.
76.
You mentioned earlier, and I'm really interested by this point. You mentioned that Grover has a flashback to his younger days when he was a school teacher, and he longs, to come back to that, which perhaps drives what he does, trying to roll mankind back to a simpler age. So I was interested in that. Another part that really grabs me is John Bennett on television is playing Finch. I think, as I said earlier, is kind of a one-dimensional bad guy. I don't know if this was in the original script and it was cut out by the production team and Hulk is reinserting it, or if Hulk, going back and writing this book after his Doctor Who TV career is over, he goes back and puts in a line that does a complete 180 on General Finch, and this is on page 115. "Thank you," said General Finch. "You see, I devised it," talking about the underground parliament rooms. He drew his service revolver from its holster and aimed it at Sarah. "I'm sorry, Miss Smith, but you're a prisoner again." She gasped. "I really do pick my friends." "Perhaps we are more friendly than you imagine." He smiled, not unkindly, she thought. What does that tell you about General Finch as a book character compared to John Bennett, the future Lee San Chang, on television?
Yeah, there is this sort of compulsory benevolence about them. These are people who don't know they're the bad guys. Whereas I think we first meet Finch when he's talking about shooting looters.
Right.
That he's somebody who, I think, like Grover, is capable of compassion and so on at an individual level, but he's very comfortable talking about kind of wiping out groups of people he doesn't know. But there is this sense, like, I mean, like, he doesn't want to. They don't have the ruthless. They've got the ruthlessness to sort of abolish human evolution, but they don't have the ruthlessness to actually do anything physically nasty to Sarah. And indeed she gets a head injury that plays a part in the script. Basically, accidentally, a rafter falls on her head. She's not coshed by anyone. These are a funny group of villains. And I think this is in some ways the sort of one of the political points that Malcolm Hulke's making, in the sort of people who are who think of themselves as decent and do have elements of decency can commit monstrosities. And this was quite sort of deep stuff for somebody who was reading it at the sort of young age I was doing. I think there was I was aware that I found some of these things sort of quite confusing at the time, and they opened my eyes a bit, and they opened my mind a bit to not thinking perhaps of people in terms of goodies and baddies all the time. It's quite easy to be simplistic about a story like, I don't know, I mean, The Mutants, for instance. In that, you've got the Marshal, who is just a psychopathic evil
Right.
genocidal monster.
Completely.
And you've got somebody like that, and there's nobody like that in this. And what Malcolm Hulke's writing, I think, does, and this technique he has of letting you into the heads of people and creatures, um, it means, yeah, it's this point of view, this the sort of big point he's making, as well as about how basically decent people can end up behaving monstrously. This thing he comes back to at the end about keeping an open mind. It's a sort of little, the whole thing's a bit of an essay on sort of keeping your empathy and your kindness. And I think it's done really well.
Let's talk about the spaceship crew, because if there are one-dimensional baddies in the story, maybe it's Adam and Ruth on the spaceship. So
Mm.
Hulk in the book gives them slightly different biographies than the characters had on television, I think. Mark, who's the good guy on the crew, is the one who ran the 3-minute mile
Yes.
in the book, which is obviously a play on Dr. Roger Bannister running the 4-minute mile. But Sarah in the book is reminded of something she was told by a journalist when she was younger. Beware of people like Oliver Cromwell who know, italices,
Mm.
that they are right, because they will do anything to justify their ends. And naturally, I'm reading this as a suburban New York City kid in the mid 80s. We did not have the English Civil War on our curriculum. So
Mhm.
it's quite possible that the very first time that I ever heard of Oliver Cromwell was right there in that passage. And I kind of had to reverse engineer in my head what it meant.
Mhm.
Then I read the novelization of The Awakening, which came out a little bit later, and that, I think, filled in the blanks for me.
Mhm. Mhm.
But it's an interesting point because you have characters on the spaceship who are so fanatically dedicated to leaving Earth and getting away from civilization that they will do anything, up to including murdering Sarah, to
Yes.
preserve their lifestyle. What they don't know, of course, is that what they are doing is inadvertently going to wipe out, billions of people on the planet Earth who are going to be
Mm.
erased and never exist.
That's an interesting inversion, isn't it? I hadn't thought of that before. You've got the sort of the top brass are okay with wiping out millions, but can't kill Sarah, whereas the crew on the spaceship have been protected from the truth that they're going to kill millions, whereas they readily consider killing Sarah. It's interesting. Different sorts of fanaticism at different levels. Yeah.
So, Lewis, when do you think the golden age is? What time precisely are Whitaker and Grover rolling them back to? Is it going to be, the pre-Roman invasion era, when you have this,
Mm.
agrarian civilization more than 2,000 years ago? Is it going to be the early Middle Ages? Is it going to be, 5,000 years back in time when you have, cavemen grunting? When exactly is this golden age? Because the television series never tells us exactly when they're going back to.
That's a really good question. I hadn't thought about it, to be honest. I kind of I imagine sort of Whitaker and Grover at the end popping up in sort of some landscape with dinosaurs. But if you think about it, the amount of energy, maybe one shouldn't think about it this deeply, the amount of energy required to hoik one dinosaur out of prehistoric, out of its thing 65 plus million years ago. Getting a load of people back that far probably would be too difficult. So we would be talking about thousands of years. And indeed, in the novelization, there's a reference that the colonists make to there being natives there. That's another interesting little passage that you see
Right.
there. So we can say that there will be sort of people of some sort there. I guess we have to think it's before the Roman conquest of Britain. That we are some sort of Neolithic. Maybe Stonehenge's technology is too advanced. I mean,
Oh,
maybe we're sort of back there. I don't know. But I think the idea that the sort of there's not enough critical mass to maintain a species. I don't think just from the colonists. And there's also this idea that they are the illuminated ones. They are the people in position of leadership in a society. So, and there's this reference to having natives to guide, I think they say.
And Whitaker and Grover, of course, get their golden age. They are
Mm.
successfully sent back in time, but we never get a follow-up story. I don't think even in Big Finish or in one of the short story anthologies from the 90s, we never actually follow them back in time and see where they wind up and whether or not they thrive. But this is another bit that is unique to the novelization and is not remotely anywhere close to being shown on television. The Doctor takes Sarah to a bookshop and he takes the Christian Bible off the shelf and he starts reading to her from the book of Ezekiel, which is also in the Hebrew Bible. It's one of the prophets, which is my childhood Jewish education did not involve reading the prophets very closely, so
Mm-hmm.
I venture that Christians are a lot more familiar with Ezekiel than I am. But he takes this line out of context where these strange angels appear out of nowhere. I don't know if the implication that Hulk is giving us is that they go back to the year 600 BC, or BCE as my people say, when Ezekiel was written,
Mm-hmm.
and influenced the events of the writing of the book of Ezekiel, or if it's just a random example of something strange happening and mankind finds ways to rationalize it. But I found it odd that Hulk goes back and quotes from scripture because obviously, coming from a communist upbringing, religious dogma was not really going to be Malcolm Hulk's strong suit. But he does reference Christianity several times
Mm.
in his novelizations.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I hadn't actually the idea that that might be a direct reference to the two golden ages sort of reappearing hadn't really occurred to me. But yeah, you can take that and run with it, I guess. Yeah, I mean, how I saw this reference was it's a little bit of it's a bit of scripture which was people were quite fond of quoting from sort of Erich von Daniken onwards, that these apparitions sound like they're described a little as if they're spacemen in sort of spacesuits and so on. We can read it in that way. So it's one of these things that got quoted as suggesting the sort of this ancient astronaut hypothesis mythology. And you see other references to it at the time. I mean, in Death to the Daleks, there's a reference to the idea that Exilons built the pyramids in Peru and so on. So, how I read it was sort of one of these 70s things of, yeah, these sort of ideas of before the ancient astronaut hypothesis acquired all the layers of mythology that it subsequently did, there was this original kind of idea which you see in one or two stories of the period in Doctor Who. And I think Terry Nation wrote a short story of some sort about it near the time. And it is just I must have I went and I looked it up in the Bible in my house and sort of checked the reference, and of course there it is. It's one of a number of very strange things in Ezekiel. I mean, that is one of the freakier books of the prophets. And no, I to me it was sort of I suppose I took it as a kind of little nod to this idea that there are sort of from the Bible now, Shakespeare. There are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamed of in my philosophy.
It's interesting where you talk about Von Daniken because thinking about my friend Kate Orman, who wrote The Left-Handed Hummingbird for the New Adventures in 1993, the first third of that book takes place during the Aztecs in the 1450s. It takes place in the Aztecs in 1487, about 30 years after Kate imagines the television story The Aztecs from season 1 to have taken place.
Mm-hmm.
So she goes back and she revisits the Aztec civilization. But she references Von Daniken directly in the text of that book, and she leans into the idea of ancient astronauts because she has a crashed Exelon spaceship outside of the city, which partly sets the events of the plot in motion. It's the most pure realization in Doctor Who of this ancient alien theory.
Interesting, yeah.
And Hulk is playing at it here, but he doesn't take sides.
No.
It would have been amazing, of course, if Grover and Whitaker show up in 1487 Mexico and start influencing the events of Left-Handed Hummingbird, but that isn't the story Kate was trying to tell.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, no, you can do all sorts of different things with them. I mean, there are these sort of things that pop up in sort of history, which, like, I want to know what all the other Scaroth splinters were up to a lot of the time. I mean, from City of Death, or whether any of them. Well, I suppose you've got at least two alien creatures splashing around in Loch Ness.
The Scarison versus the Scarison
Borad,
versus
yeah.
the Borad, yes.
Yes. So God knows what's going on there. And also, I mean, while we're on these sorts of crossovers, I wonder if what Whitaker's trying to do is a lot like what Kerensky's trying to do in City of Death as well. You have this sort of idea of a bubble where time passes at a different rate than anywhere else. I mean, in a sense, Scaroth's project is pretty much what Grover and, in terms of time technology, is pretty much what Whitaker and Grover are trying to do. I mean, Scaroth, well, it's sort of, I guess, because Doctor Who's a British series, that Franco-Russian time research was running 5 years slower than it was in Britain.
If you think that the fate of Professor Blinovich is grim in this book, the fate that James Goss gives Kerensky in the City of Death novelization, where Kerensky is living in that bubble in real time, and the line is, it took Professor Kerensky the rest of his life to die, and he spends decades in that time bubble.
Oh my God, that's horrifying. It's bad enough as it is on screen.
See, on screen, he's doing that, walk like an Egyptian thing with his arms, and he dies almost instantaneously. But James Goss reimagines that. It's in both the hardcover novelization and in the cut-down Target reprint, which is almost a different book entirely. But he preserves that, and in the Target paperback as well, it takes poor Professor Kerensky the rest of his life to die. Now, there's one important character that we haven't really discussed in the novelization of Dinosaur Invasion, and that's poor Captain Yates. This is the middle of his 3-story arc, where he goes from dupe to villain to redeemed hero, going from the Green Death and ending in Planet of the Spiders. Both of those books were novelized earlier, and I've talked about Captain Yates a little bit in those 2 earlier episodes. I had talked about the Green Death in episode 15 with Hannah Long, and I had talked about Planet of the Spiders a week later with Graham Burke. This is the last of the trilogy, but it's being told out of order in novelization form. It's the middle story. Does Mike Yates get that kind of story arc here, or is he kind of an afterthought in the book, and he doesn't really have his plot end wrapped up as satisfactorily as it is on television?
As you say, it is the middle of his arc. I think he's underwritten in this. I mean, I don't think we actually. While Hulk, I mean, this is a good point. I mean, it's not one I'd really kind of thought of before you just mention it, but we don't get an awful lot of Mike Yates's interior journey here, whereas that's actually quite interesting. We know that there is one, that there are little clues scattered around as to who's a golden ager throughout this thing, that the Brigadier thinks of General Finch as being sort of like something from a bygone age. We have Grover's nostalgia. We have Mike also talking about how nice it is that London air is clean and you can hear the wildlife and so on's back.
Yesterday I saw a fox in Piccadilly. Yes.
Yes, and setting up the line very nicely for Sarah Nightingale in Berkeley Square. You get a bit of that, but you don't actually you don't understand quite. You can sort of put it together yourself that I suppose I suppose his experience with Boss in the Green Death. You got something sort of complex and industrial and polluting, and you can see him wanting to react in favor of a simpler, better life, but he does it through this mode of getting involved in this conspiracy. And he's not as. I remember reading this the sort of first time, and the two, because he is this sort of. He's not as sort of fully formed and realised a character as Benton or the Brigadier is. I think throughout. I think either in the television or in the books. And he doesn't emerge as a strong character in this story. I mean, he does in Planet of the Spiders. I think the novelization there, I think, is interesting about Yates. And the one I always remember is the Day of the Daleks, where he swipes Benton's dinner. But yeah, no, I think if you're making the point I think you're making, that there is something he is a bit of an absence at the core of the story here.
Had Terrence novelized this story, I think he would have played a lot more into that story arc.
Mm-hmm.
There is a scene on television where the Brigadier explains that Mike is going to be given a chance to retire rather than face charges.
Yes.
That scene is replaced with the bookshop Bible quoting from Ezekiel scene, so it's not in the novelization.
Okay.
So Mike is left at a massive cliffhanger. Now, if you've already read Planet of the Spiders, which came out first, that's already been resolved for you.
Yes.
But I don't know if Hulk was aware of that. Hulk has a serious moment where Yates, a long-running character, pulls a gun on his superior, and Hulk doesn't take the time in the book to explain what's going to happen to Yates next, where it was pretty important on television. So that's maybe one area where the book is... Hulk is a lot more interested in his own characters than he is in Captain Yates, which is a slight pity, but it's by no means a deal breaker. There's much to praise about the book, even though that bit is missing.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, I don't know. I agree very much with that. The ending is, I think, what seems to have done, what he seems to do with the complete replacement of the ending is that he's putting in this lesson about keeping an open mind, which I think he feels is the lesson of this story. And he's taking out the bits that actually point forwards in Doctor Who, which are Mike Yates's story, and also the Doctor kind of converting, the Doctor persuading Sarah to come with him to Florana. Which is important for the continuity of Doctor Who, because in a sense she's not been on a sort of fully voluntary TARDIS journey with him yet at all. I don't think, has she?
No, this is when he's returning her to Earth after she stows away on the Time Warrior, and she's not a proper companion yet because she hasn't had the moment where she agrees to stay on.
And that moment is given for us in the television series, whereas I guess from Hulk's point of view, writing in 76, Sarah is the companion, and explaining why she's there is less significant, I guess. And I guess it is sort of slightly self-indulgent for Hulk to... I mean, it's self-indulgent. I probably wouldn't have resisted in his place either, but to kind of hammer home his moral rather than sort of contribute to the development of a series narrative.
So, Lewis, as we're wrapping up, I want to do two things. Number one, I want to play with you a game of 20 questions, which has become a recurring feature of this podcast. I have selected from randomizer.net one Doctor Who story or one serial from the whole of 1963 to 2022.
Okay.
Using the game of 20 questions, you are going to guess which story I have randomly selected. Question one.
And they have to be yes or no questions.
Correct.
And that, okay, you know the joke about the lawyer who gives you 3 questions for $100 thing. I'm not going to go through all of that. Okay, is it a classic series one?
Yes, it is.
Is it 70s?
No. Question 3.
Is it 60s?
No. Question 4.
Right. Oh, I stand a chance. Um, is it Colin?
No. Question 5.
Is there only one companion?
No. Question 6.
Was Sayward script editing it?
Yes, he was. Question 7.
Is it on Earth?
No, it is not on Earth. It does not take place on Earth. Question 8.
Is it part of a wider arc?
In the sense that you're thinking, no, it is not part of, for example, a trilogy. Question 9.
Okay. Is the Master in it?
Yes, he is. Question 10.
Okay, I'm going to shoot. Is it Planet of Fire?
It is not Planet of Fire. Question 11.
Bollocks. Oh dear. Oh, of course, Planet of Fire is partly on Earth, isn't it? Yeah. Oh my goodness. Is Tegan in it?
Yes, she is. Question 12.
Is Adric in it?
Adric is not in it. Question 13.
Oh wow, we are. If my brain were working properly, I would have this by now.
It's a master story, script edited by Eric Sayward, and it's not Planet of Fire. So you're really, really teetering on the brink here. There aren't too many other choices that it could be.
No, they're not, are there?
You've narrowed it down to 2 choices. I'll tell you that. Actually, no. Check that. You've narrowed it down. Yeah, 2 choices because Adric is in Time Flight.
Yeah, that's kind of true, isn't it? It's not Earthbound, so it's not. Oh God. The King's Demons is Earthbound.
It is not King's Demons, if that was the question. So now we're at question 14.
Question 14. And this is just like sort of watching the 8-ball kind of judder around the pocket, I realise.
An Eric Sayward story with the Master and without Adric that is not King's Demons and is not Planet of Fire. So I think you only have one choice left.
I'm just sort of trying to run through what the Master was doing all this sodding time. Oh, it's the 5 Doctors.
Yes, it is. It is the 5 Doctors.
Thank God for that. Yeah,
you got it in 15. That is of the 4 times that I've played the game, you've done it in the 3rd lowest amount of questions. So you're not the winner, but you are not in last place yet.
I should have shot for that earlier. I really should have done. But never mind.
It's an unusual choice because it's kind of an anniversary story, but it does slot into the main canon, and it's important to the ongoing arc of the story in terms of the Doctor's relationship with Gallifrey, even if it's not part of a discrete, standalone, 80s style 3-episode trilogy itself.
Yeah, I mean that's what I was trying to exclude. Sort of one of the Black Guardian stories, basically.
And there are 2 scenes that take place on Earth because you have the 2nd Doctor visiting the unit reunion and you have Sarah Jane and K9, but primarily it is not an Earthbound story.
Indeed, I think that's a fair description, yeah.
So, Lewis, thank you very much for joining us today.
Pleasure.
Where can we find you online?
I am at Lewis Baston 5 talking Doctor Who, at Lewis_Baston talking about political and other horrible things like that. And yeah, I'm fairly regularly Twittering, but that's more or less my only social media. Please do come and follow if you can.
And we'll see you back here to discuss Doctor Who and the Sunmakers in several months' time.
I really look forward to it. Thank you so much. Such a pleasure talking to you, Jason.
You too. Have a great day now. Doctor Who and the Dinosaur Invasion. Written by Malcolm Hulke. Televised as Invasion of the Dinosaurs, except Part 1, which went out as Invasion. Teleplay by Malcolm Hulke. televised in January and February 1974, published in February 1976. The Doctor walked slowly forward into the cul-de-sac. The giant dinosaur turned its head to focus on the midget now approaching. The Doctor aimed his gun to fire. Suddenly from behind came a great roar of anger. He spun round. Blocking the exit from the narrow street towered a Tyrannosaurus Rex, its savage jaws dripping with blood. The Doctor and Sarah arrived back in the TARDIS to find London completely deserted, except for the dinosaurs. Has the return of these prehistoric creatures been deliberately planned? And if so, who can be behind it all? I've had trouble reviewing this book in the past. I wrote a long-form review for Stacy Smith's Ratings Guide last year, written in May 2021, during the Pertwee era portion of my pilgrimage, although I cut down a lot of extraneous material from that review in a flailing effort to go under the Ratings Guide's informal word count, and I neglected to save that extra material. I also found a draft email and then another in an old Word document, two previous attempts to write a review of Doctor Who and the Dinosaur Invasion, probably over the last 8 years. One was for an earlier read-through of the book. I never did finish writing that review, but I think it was in 2013. And then I tried again in 2017 in a post for my blog that I never finished, having not updated the blog after Planet of the Spiders. Now, I love this novelization for personal levels, but for some reason I've had 3 attempts to write a review, and it took a lot of effort just to finish the third one. Not sure why that is. Here's what I almost wrote but didn't finish for my blog back in 2017. I wrote, "We are sadly reaching the end of the Malcolm Hulke back catalog. Before this book was written, there were only 2 Malcolm Hulke novelizations that were yet to be written, and then 2 more Hulke co-written serials. With the exception of The Faceless Ones, a story on which Hulke shared credit with David Ellis, Hulke would get to his own stories slowly, averaging less than a book a year, before his death in 1979. Doctor Who and the Dinosaur Invasion is not his best work. I say that advisedly because it's probably in the top 25% of novelizations, but rereading his previous books, starting with The Cave Monsters, his first, and then up through his most recent one to this point, The Green Death, Hulke's previous characteristics were to invest the episodes 1 and 2 material from television with a ton of detail, making those portions of the book longer than their TV counterparts, and he would give detailed fictional biographies of his villains, making them understandable if not sympathetic. From Dr. Quinn and Major Barker in Cave Monsters to Captain Dent in Doomsday Weapon, and to a slightly lesser extent Dr. Stevens in Green Death, the Hulke villain is a fascinating person to read about. Dinosaur Invasion does not adhere to Hulke's previous standards. The Part 1 material runs out before the end of Chapter 2, and therefore does not take up a disproportionate amount of the book. The 2 principal villains, Dr. Whittaker, the unprincipled scientist, and Charles Grover, the 2 principal member of Parliament, are given very little biographical information. We learn through dialogue that Whittaker was an eminent scientist who disappeared when his time travel experiments were derided. Then we also learn through dialogue from TV that Grover was an environmentalist crusader who wrote a book called Last Chance for Man. But that's it. Whittaker is given several POV scenes, but Hulke uses those to express Whittaker's disdain for every other human being in his orbit, and Grover, I think, is only given half of one POV scene. We don't really get their detailed backstories or their villain origins. What's interesting about the villains is that they're more or less left-wing villains, or at least Grover is. Major Barker had been a fierce nationalist. Captain Dent was a rapacious corporate executive. Dr. Stevens worked for a multinational chemical corporation which generated toxic byproducts. We know who all those people are, and they're still out there today in 2022. Woe betide us. Grover is a slightly different beast. He's an earnest politician, desperate to stop and reverse the pollution of planet Earth. Grover's means to do this is to team up with Whittaker, the scientist, and literally roll back time, for all but him and a group of hand-picked survivors, to erase centuries' worth of human history, and to start over at some point in the distant past, to rebuild the then pastoral Earth along their own moral guidelines. Grover's means for doing this involves saving a few hundred Londoners out of a worldwide population of billions, but that may have just been a function of storytelling in 1974, where it's hard to fit a completely multinational cast inside the narrow confines of Television Center Studio 3. But fortunately, we are dealing with a fictional program here. Setting aside the foibles of the parent TV story, Dinosaur Invasion is to date the most mechanical and the least elaborate of all Hulk's novelizations. I find it interesting, though, to go through the book, episode by episode, and see what Hulk changed for the book and why. The main plot beats are there, but as always, Hulk jettisons much of the TV dialogue and doesn't include any changes made during rehearsal or filming. So, for example, that long chase sequence in Part 5 showing off John Pertwee's pet flying car, the Whomobile, previously seen earlier in the novelization of Planet of the Spiders, is condensed from 12 minutes on screen to one short paragraph in the book. That's as far as I got earlier. That was 2017, and you can see why I didn't finish. I don't even agree with a lot of the stuff that I wrote 5 years ago, and I was changing some words on the fly. My apologies. Here is the rest of my current Ratings Guide review. This was written in May 2021, and it is currently pending publication on that site. Doctor Who and the Dinosaur Invasion opens with a prologue, which oddly is not mentioned in the table of contents. It occurs on page 6, whereas most Target books begin on page 7, and it's called The Dinosaurs. 350 million years ago, reptiles became the first animals to breed on land. Reptilian land life developed into many forms. The first true dinosaurs, not more than 6 inches long, appearing during the Triassic period. Footnote: Triassic, after the threefold mountain system in Germany. The first mammals, and also flies and termites, appeared at that time. By 150 million years ago, some reptiles had developed into giants. One, the Diplodocus, measured 84 feet from head to tip of tail, and must have weighed 35 tons. During the age of the reptiles, many varieties of dinosaur, all enormous in size, spread and multiplied over the Earth's surface. Then, over a very short period, in geological terms, the dinosaurs died out. Their remains have been found in every continent. Was it a sudden change in the Earth's temperature that killed them off? Was it disease? Or did the newer and more nimble life forms, the mammals, attack and kill them? Perhaps no one will ever know. Certainly, no one ever expected them to come back. Now, this is written in 1976. This is before we learned about the asteroid theory, and I would imagine that, I'm not a paleontologist, but I would imagine that just about every word in that introduction is now wrong. When I first got into dinosaurs, it would have been 1979. I was about 6 years old, and I spent the next 2 years of my life acquiring every dinosaur toy that my parents could afford and reading every book on dinosaurs that I could get out of the library. This was over 40 years ago now, and all that information, again, is probably stunningly incorrect. Then as now, I lived in the New York City area, and I would have paid several visits to the Museum of Natural History on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and the dinosaur exhibit has changed dramatically between 1979 and 2022. It would be interesting to go back in time and visit the dinosaur exhibit, which I have very little recollection of now, having been to the new exhibit too many times. But again, just about everything that Hulk wrote about dinosaurs in 1976 is probably incorrect today. Bearing aside that, I would say that the final line, certainly no one ever expected them to come back, is the perfect gut punch to lead us into Chapter 1 and the book proper. Chapter 1 is called London Alert! This chapter deletes any TV scenes from Part 1 involving Unit, so as you're reading it, you are as blind as the Doctor and Sarah Jane as to why London is deserted. The TV Doctor and Sarah dialogue is plain and functional. Part 1 rests heavily on Patty Russell's direction. The book adds a lot of dialogue, which is pretty fascinating. It's an interesting discussion between the two of them. We talk about the Mary Celeste, The Doctor mocks Sarah's delight in seeing something as mundane and earthbound as Woolworths, and kind of like the Doctor's long walk with Joe Grant in Doctor Who and the Green Death, the Doctor engaging Sarah in an intellectual exercise as they walk across a strangely deserted London. Most importantly, Chapter 1 introduces us to the ultimate poor doomed sap, Shugi McPherson. Characters from Malcolm Hogue prologues don't generally tend to survive past page 10, but Shugi is the best of them. Ethnically, it's a bit questionable. He is a drunken Scotsman who comes down to London with his friends to see the football, and the dinosaurs invade, and he spends 3 days left behind in London on a drunk, with this remarkable paragraph on page 9. In the front bedroom, partly hidden at the back of the wardrobe, Shugi found the 6 bottles of whiskey that were to be his only companions for the next 4 days. Shugi just about makes it to the back of page 10, sees a dinosaur, starts to pray. His words were drowned by a sudden roar from the monster behind him. Shugi turned and looked up. A massive claw hit him in the face. In his last moment of life, Shugi McPherson resolved to give up drinking whiskey. Chapter 2 mostly deals with the Doctor and Sarah's captivity by the regular army, but Hulk plays with the narrative. He gives us POV sentences from army officers and sergeants. Here's a line. He had been on duty for many hours without sleep. He was tired. He hated looters. There's a longer explanation for the dinosaur's presence, and Hulk kills, off-screen, some children who'd run into a dinosaur on Hampstead Heath. Lodge's exit is better on TV. He gets distracted lecturing Sarah Jane on his troubled childhood, and the Doctor uses Venusian Ooja on him from behind. The Doctor also gets to explain to Sarah Jane what Mews are, as the book fulfills its educational remit. There is a lot of material in Part 1 on TV which deals with UNIT, but again, all that material is excised so that the first 2 chapters primarily take place only from the Doctor and Sarah's point of view. This means we lose a lot of exposition, the kind of material that was necessary to fill out 25 minutes of programming in a studio-bound production. It does, however, perhaps take a little bit of the televised flavor away from the book. Chapter 3 is called The Time Eddy. It features some sharp exchanges between the Doctor and General Finch. Hulk describes Sarah as taking, quote, an instant dislike, end quote, to the General, which is a line that I've used many times ever since in my own life. This material sings in print, and so does Captain Yates's pining away for a pre-industrial Earth. Sarah chastises the lost-in-time medieval peasant for having tried to slaughter a poor defenseless pig, and the Doctor gives lectures on the relativity of time, talking about, quote-unquote, that chap Einstein, and gives us a lesson about the time that it would take the light from a star to arrive on Earth, talking about stars that were shining from the time of Jesus. If you were to look at Earth from that planet, you would see the Romans invading Britain. This material is much more Doctorish in print than even the great John Pertwee made the Doctor in the corresponding material on TV. The scene in Chapter 3, told from the point of view of a Stegosaurus, is poetry. We learn that the Stegosaurus longed only to munch peacefully on big, green leaves. Professor Whittaker, one of our bad guys, is introduced in Chapter 4, The Time Scoop. Hulk's genius was adding cynical thought processes to children's books. Adults can deduce why he calls attention to Whittaker's well-manicured fingernails, twice, as Lewis told us earlier in the program, but kids can certainly appreciate the irony that Whittaker hates Butler for his scar, until Butler praises him. He liked it, when other people acknowledged his brilliance and genius, at which point the scar becomes a pity. In the very next scene, the Doctor is parallel with Whittaker, disrupted while building a thing and wishing Yates would go away. Hulk dips into Grover's head for 3 sentences and hides the entire plot in broad daylight. Quote, he wished he could have that time over again. End quote. Chapter 5, Monster in Chains, is 19 pages long and encompasses almost all of Part 3. This includes sharper dialogue in the Yates, Whittaker, and Butler scene than we got on television, and also sharper dialogue in the Doctor, Finch, and Grover scene, all of which was presumably written by Hulk in advance but trimmed for television. The Doctor in the book wonders if the dinosaurs dream. The Brigadier laughs at him. And we get our long-awaited explanation for what really happened to Professor Blinovich, as Lewis and I discussed earlier in the program. Hulk drops in a brief lesson about the flora of the Cretaceous era and gives us a delicious POV paragraph told by the T-Rex. Quote, "Most of the monster's prey was like this just before being eaten, mouth open in fear, making a loud noise." The Brigadier accurately observes that Finch lives in a bygone age, and Grover paints an awful picture of what an H-bomb attack would have meant for the city of London. Grover says a lot more to Sarah in the book. "When you understand everything, you will be eternally grateful. Believe me, my dear, and try to trust me." The villains on TV are just that, villains. But by truly believing himself to be a hero in print, Grover may be one of the finest villains Hulk ever novelized, except of course for that unfortunate lack of backstory and origin. You'll notice that a theme of the novelization is that the dialogue is sharper. Characters speak in metaphor, characters are a little more rude to one another. The things the Doctor and Grover and Finch and Whittaker and Butler say to each other in the book, very little of this appears on television. As I mentioned earlier, the television dialogue is a lot more functional. Hulk in the book puts in a lot more science and just a lot more observational humor and reality in the way that characters address one another with hidden agendas and grudges and passive aggressiveness, which really doesn't come across on television. Let's have a listen to some of that television material and see how it stacks up to Malcolm Hulk's print dialogue.
Returning your prisoner, sir.
How did you leave the ship?
There isn't any spaceship. Stop playing.
Did you tell anybody?
No, fortunately everyone was out of the way. I think the Doctor has escaped again.
I did everything you asked me to incriminate him. All wasted.
You did very well.
Have you any idea where he is?
He's probably on his way here now. But he needn't worry us. The countdown is too close.
It's time to go into the final phase. You, Whittaker, will produce a last wave of apparition monsters all over London to drive out any remaining people. You will order the complete withdrawal of all your troops, including Unit.
Brigadier is bound to protest.
You have final authority. Overrule him.
Well, I'll see to it right away. What about the girl?
Leave her to me.
Well, don't lose her again.
Now then, what are we to do with you?
Just don't put me back on your fake spaceship, that's all.
I don't think that'd be a good idea. You're rather a bad influence.
What you're doing to those people on there is cruel. They all believe that they're going to a new world.
And so they are. But their new world is this one. This world of ours, swept clean and returned to its early innocence.
You're going to take them back to the past?
We're going to bring the past to them.
I don't understand.
By rolling back time. By taking the Earth back to an earlier, purer age.
Oh, what about all the people on Earth now?
They'll vanish. They and their ancestors will never have been born.
That's horrible. It's worse than murder.
No, you don't understand.
For comparison's sake, here is how Hulk adapts that material for the book. This is on page 116. Sarah: "That's mass murder." "As I said," Grover continued calmly, "they will know nothing about it. We had to clear London so that undesirable people not approved by us as right-thinking, wouldn't be taken back through time with us. What a disgusting idea," she blurted out, "to destroy the whole world because it isn't quite as you like it. Eventually you will see our point of view, Miss Smith." Grover straightened up. "Now we have much work to do. Operation Golden Age is close at hand. Professor Whittaker is about to materialize dinosaurs throughout London, finally to clear the streets of soldiers, looters, and anyone else who may still be in the area. Then you will accompany us back through time to the pure, unpolluted world which we seek. The world as you know it no longer exists, and will never have existed. Italicized, exclamation point, close quote. The TV material is longer and has more exposition. In the print material, the exposition is substantially reduced or reworked, and characters just speak their minds. It's much more cynical in the book, and I prefer it to the TV dialogue. Certainly the lines from the book have more resonance in my head over years than most of the TV material. The back half of the book, which encompasses parts 4 through 6 on TV, is shorter than the first half, 57 pages compared to 78. Chapter 6 truncates the Doctor's location-heavy drive through London and simplifies his journey underground. This was written before there was a Whomobile, which doesn't show up. Remarkable is Whittaker, who, as Lewis argues earlier, is coded as a gay man, talking about how handsome the Doctor is and refusing to kill him. Butler, wonderfully, secretly hates Whittaker, as much as Whittaker secretly hates him. Quote, Butler would very much have liked to batter Professor Whittaker's head to a pulp, or, wishing he could drive his fist into Whittaker's pale face and break all his teeth. This is great when you're 11 years old, by the way. The back cover categorizes this book as children's fiction. Amusingly, when Sarah Jane is forced to eat the spaceship people's organic brown bread in Chapter 7, she describes it as awful. The secret underground cabinet room has a portrait of President Kennedy, even though the book is set in 1975, according to Chapter 7, which would have been the Ford presidency. Chapter 8 in the book is where Mike Yates is outed as a traitor. Hulk conveys his heartbreak with the wonderfully understated line, "For years the Doctor and Captain Yates had been good friends." But it's mostly Sarah who escapes the reminder room, escapes the phony spaceship, and gets recaptured and brought right back to the spaceship by General Finch. Hulk adds depth to the spaceship elders, who here are vegetarians, and Sarah's observation about being wary of people like Oliver Cromwell who know they are right. Sarah gets a moment of self-doubt as she opens the spaceship's airlock hatch, aware of what will happen if she's wrong about where she is. And best of all, as Finch recaptures Sarah Jane and she laments not knowing how to pick her friends, he gets a reply that was not on TV. "Perhaps we are more friendly than you imagine," as he smiles, quote, "not unkindly," end quote. Imagine had John Bennett been given that line, that would have put his whole one-dimensional TV villain into a different light. Part 5 on TV invests half its running time in a long chase. That is not what the novelization does. Working presumably from Hulk's drafts that were written before there was a Whomobile, that material is condensed into a single sentence. Later on, Sarah says, "You'd be quite handsome without that scar, you know." This is a somewhat cruel remark to Butler, which triggers another great perception shift, as we learn that Butler is perhaps the most noble character in the piece. On TV, Butler, although played by Martin Jarvis, was a rather characterless bit part. The Doctor's plea to Yates to make a better Earth is longer than on TV, and features the line, "You can treat people with different colored skins as equals." This is very poignant in the year 2022, let me tell you. Chapter 10 is called The Final Countdown, and yes, I was singing that when I read it in the book. It restructures the ending at least a little bit. Whittaker and Grover disappear before the Doctor undoes Operation Golden Age. It's missing a script editor's touch. As I mentioned earlier with Lewis, there's no mention of Mike Yates' dismissal from unit. There's no charming moment of Benton glowing that he had punched a general in the face, cueing the Brigadier's sour look. But there is a very Hulkian moment, where the spaceship people learn what Operation Golden Age really means, and still want to go through with it. Grover gets another wonderful, not quite a villain line. 20 years in politics has taught me that people only believe what they want to believe. I suppose that goes for us all, in a way. This line was nowhere near television, but I wish it had been. And what I imagine was Hulk's original ending has the Doctor taking Sarah to a Charing Cross bookseller and reading her Ezekiel chapter 1, verses 5 and 6. "You know, there's a book you might try reading sometime," he tells her. I couldn't imagine that being produced on television either. Across the years, passages from this book have burned into my brain. It's sharper and it's harder than the TV product, and is shockingly cynical for a kid's book. But I suppose, in the end, that's what makes it so wonderful. It's not as epic as the Cave Monsters, or the Green Death, or the Sea Devils, so it is not in the top half of Malcolm Hulk novelizations. We have Doctor Who and the Space War, and we have Doctor Who and the War Games yet to come, and then much later on you would get Doctor Who and the Faceless Ones, which was written by Terrence Dicks instead of Malcolm Hulk. We are now more than halfway done with Malcolm Hulk novelizations. Again, this might not be as good as the others, and therefore not one of Hulk's best jobs, but it still is, in spite of all that, pretty incredible. Next time, we jump forward another month in time to March 1976, and Brian Hales' sadly final Doctor Who novelization. It's the second of 4 appearances of a classic Doctor Who monster, and their origin story, to boot, as we travel ahead to the Ice Age of the year 3000 and Doctor Who and the Ice Warriors. Thank you for joining me on another episode of Doctor Who Literature. I'm Jason, your host, editor, and producer. Special thanks to my special guest, Louis Baston. This podcast is brought to you by Anchor and can also be found on Spotify and Google Podcasts. You can find me on Twitter at Doctor Who Novels, that's Dr. Who Novels, and you can also find me on the Trap One podcast from time to time. I write about Doctor Who on Twitter using the hashtag Doctor Who Pilgrimage, that's Dr. Who Pilgrimage. Please drop me a line with your comments, questions, and suggestions. Next time we'll be discussing another novelization, and we'll again be joined by a very special guest. Thank you for listening, and whatever you do, keep turning the pages.